Maciej, welcome to the Judgment Call podcast. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you for having me here.
Hey, absolutely. You run something really interesting, and you are the co-founder and the CIO of Amtelon Capital, which really focuses on investing primarily in equities in Iran, from what I understand. That sounds really cool and really unique. I have never heard about an investment fund out there that actually invests in Iran. How did that happen? How did you get started, and why Iran? Why not something that's a little more politically correct, so to speak?
Yes. Well, it is super exciting. And when I speak to the local regulator in Iran, they tell us that we are their favorite foreign investor, foreign institutional investor, because we are the only one, right? There is really no other foreign institutional investor in Iran, so we are the only ones. So I decided to launch Amtelon Capital back in 2016 when JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, was implemented. And and the reason why Iran and not something else was actually this is actually pretty simple. There was no other market. There is still no other market at this moment in the world with lower valuations, a higher growth potential, both like a long-term structural growth potential, as well as near-term growth that will be coming from the reopening of the country, or reintegration of the country with the rest of the world. And to be honest, this is potentially the last opportunity of this size. So the type of opportunity I mean is a transformational opportunity. So a country going from one situation, because it's not from one system to another. I don't expect any political, revolution or transformation there. But the economic situation will change. Will change from a decades of sanctions, where the economy was basically cut off from the rest of the world, to the economy that is slowly opening up, catching up with the rest of emerging markets, with everything good that happened in the rest of the emerging markets over the last 2 decades. And on top of that, no one is there. So Americans cannot touch it. So all the big funds out there have to wait until the primary US sanctions are lifted. So suddenly you get to go to a new market like this, of this size, and invest before the big US funds go there. It doesn't happen too often. And when I mean of this size, what I mean by this size is, that's another unique thing, is that you may have some frontier markets that you can get excited about because of demographics, growth potential, whatever. But usually they have no capital markets. You can go and launch startups, build a factory, a bank, whatever. And here you already have pretty well developed capital markets. Stock market with 600 companies. Right now it's around $250 billion market cap. Back in 2016, it was already $100 billion market cap. And right now, several $100 million turnover per day. So, big enough market to be attractive even for big investors. I mean, it too big to ignore, basically. And for us, with a new fund, startup fund, that wants to basically focus on this niche and do the initial fundraising and so on. Well, that was looked as an amazing setup with everything that we needed in place. So hence the decision. And the important thing is that I had no connections to Iran. So I actually had never met an Iranian in my life before my first visit to Tehran. So I had no bias. It wasn't the case that half of my family was actually from Iran, so it was somehow convenient for me to focus on this market and maybe travel more, whatever. No, I was able to focus on any market out there, and Iran was just based on the risk reward that I saw there. Risk being obviously geopolitics, but it seemed to be at that time turning into more positive momentum. And reward coming from the lowest valuations in the world, and all this growth potential looked to me like exactly like the best risk reward out there.
Yeah, so it's either a very gutsy or a very crazy decision that you made a couple of years back. I hope it's the former. One thing that I heard you talk about on another show is that you compared Iran right now to a post-1990s Russia. Eastern Germany did this very low earnings to valuation ratios. You had where just this climate where everyone had this appreciation of change, appreciation of the future. Entrepreneurship was strong and was really grassroots. Not what we see now in the US, where you need to be at $3 billion. No, it's something where we all felt, and I was part of that in Eastern Germany, where we all felt the future is kind of in our hands, and we did this grassroots, and that's the concepts, grassroots entrepreneurship, as he describes of what we are missing, and it really drove in Eastern Europe really quickly into, well, a decent part of the European community where they are right now, rather than 10, 15 years. It happened really quickly. Why do you say Iran is at a similar precipice? And do you see any catalysts that it will very quickly, say the next 10 years, will be more like a normal Middle East country, which is, you know, the Middle Eastern countries they have quite a bit of turmoil, at least some of them. We just talked about Syria a couple of episodes ago. Why do you think Iran is at the precipice?
Yeah, look, so it is fair to compare it to Eastern Europe in the 90s. It's not the same. It's always different. But what I mean by that is that certain dynamics may be similar. So going from one system that is restricted in some way in Eastern Europe, it was, you know, socialism / communism, and this people were entrepreneurial, but they were not free to really you know, do what they wanted to do. And then after 1989, all this unlocked. Torsten, I lost you completely for a moment.
I'm here.
Okay, good. I lost the screen for the moment. Okay, anyway, so what I was saying. So in Eastern Europe after 1989, all this energy was unlocked basically, and people really wanted to work, and they started you know, chasing their dreams, and you could see this entrepreneurship in action. It was quite chaotic in the 90s. You know, I lived in the 90s in Poland, and it was chaos. I mean, there were, you know, institutions were not working properly. It was corrupt. Bureaucracy was a huge headache. It was absolutely a mess in many places, but it worked, and the pace of changes was amazing. So everything was very dynamic. So after 10 or 20 years, Poland changed completely, and the rest of Eastern Europe. It became much more stable, much more easy to forecast, but also hence much more institutionalized in every corner. But hence also your expected return also much closer to the mean, let's say, to whatever from, I don't know, investing in real estate right now in Eastern Europe is similar to Western Europe, actually, in terms of your, risk reward. So this is what I expect in Iran, a similar growth coming from people who are entrepreneurial and from foreign investment. Because look, the same role as Eastern Europe played for Western Europe in the 90s, for Germany mainly, but also France, Italy, where Eastern Europe was basically a hub, a source of cheap labor, where it made total sense to locate your factories over there, take advantage of this cheap labor force, and then also be ready to benefit from the growing middle class that was showing up there like 10 or 20 years later. And suddenly it was, it became an important consumer market. Same thing will happen in Iran. I mean, Iran is quite a big country. It's 84 million people. They have the largest oil and gas reserves, combined oil and gas reserves in the world. Plenty of zinc and copper resources as well. But the most important resource is the population, is the Iranian population. It's a well-educated society with a median age of 30 years old, where I think it's unlike the rest of the Middle East. It's not very similar to other Middle Eastern countries. It's the sense of 5,000 years of history that they have is you can feel that, and this is what's been important for them generation after generation. So this focus on education and so on. So you have very skilled labor force, which because of the sanctions is right now cheaper than in Vietnam. So the average salary is probably around $200 in Iran. You can even hire computer scientists, so people who can code for $800, whereas even in Nizhny Novgorod, somewhere in the middle of Russia, it costs you $3,000, right, to hire someone. Right now, for you, if you're a big European or Asian corporation and want to looking for a place to manufacture stuff, and then also to start promoting your brand because you will find you want to be present in the new consumer market, it's a no-brainer to go there. But also, it's not only that, it's not only these 84 million people, because Iran has very good links with other countries in the region, all the neighbors. So Iran plus all the neighboring countries, it's more than 500 million people. And countries like Iraq or Afghanistan, which is obviously in the news right now, they import most of their products from Iran, the products they consume from Iran, not only oil or gasoline, but food, cars, car parts, even cement. So things that are not that easy to import. So companies that are based in Iran are well positioned to export in the whole region. So this is another argument for big multinationals to go to Iran as soon as geopolitics allow. So this is another reason why I think that it could be similar to Eastern Europe. Of course, the differences are big as well, because Eastern Europe, or at least Central Europe, was on the path to NATO and then European Union quite quickly. So nothing like this will happen in Iran. But what might be similar, and I think will be similar, is that big FDI investment should come from major European companies, which are already there. A lot of Swiss and German companies and French and Italian companies are already there, have been operating under the radar throughout the Trump administration, just not to get into trouble, but have been patiently waiting for an opportunity to scale up their operations. And we are in touch with them. We're speaking with all of them to understand what's going on, and they are all thinking about expanding their operations. Same for big Japanese companies. Yeah.
Well, when we just talked about sanctions, but only briefly, and I think this is a huge catalyst, right? So maybe we roll up at this story of sanctions a little bit, right? So from what I know, and this is very limited, the sanctions were put in place for the nuclear uranium enrichment, that a lot of countries were concerned that there's a nuclear weapon that Iran will build and use against Israel. I think that was the biggest concern. A really near-term concern. And then there was an agreement reached, I think it was under the Obama administration, that they stopped doing this. They only use it for civilian purposes for a couple of nuclear power plants. And then once they adhere to this, it would be, and that was, I think, the story of the end of the Obama administration. That was basically the catalyst for working with Iran with less sanctions, right? So there's still sanctions in place with much less. And then Trump came around, picture changed, and Iran was that big bogeyman. Based on the analysis of that administration, that there was a lot of state-sponsored terrorism, and we know that Iran does it through proxies. And obviously, what's terrorism and what's the freedom fight is very difficult to say sometimes, right? So we do know that there is a gray line, a gray zone. That we see this with the Taliban in Afghanistan, who were friends, enemies. Now they are like an administration. We really don't know what they are and who they are to an extent. So maybe you can help us understand. So what happened to these sanctions? Are they justified? And do you think they just going to go away very soon under the Biden administration, which would be obviously a huge catalyst?
So there are many different types of sanctions, and those sanctions have been in place for quite a long time. I mean, the first event that influenced the relations between Iran and the US was obviously the Iranian Revolution, 1979, and the takeover of the US embassy and the American hostages. So, it happened a long time ago, but it's based on what I managed to find out and understand. This is something that basically poisoned the relations for decades to come. It's actually amazing, but this one event was so strong that it fueled the propaganda on both sides, meaning American politicians were using this argument to portray Iran as the bad actor always, and was very much in line with the recent history and with the sentiment in the US. Iran obviously did the opposite. I mean, the same thing, but towards the US in its own country. So, death to America for the last 40 or 50 years. And this is the big Satan, and the whole maybe not the policy, but the philosophy of the country is very much centered around the active fight against the US. So it's a problem, because then when they sit down and want to talk, it's just much more difficult, because even if they want to make a deal quickly and smoothly, and if they agree on the principles, they have a lot of this sentiment that is a very long term and well established on both sides that they need to deal with. So I think this is actually the biggest issue in speaking to each other. Then at some point they also had more hardline leadership on both sides, right? So either on the US side, when Iran was getting into the axis of evil or any this type of philosophy, then in Iran you had Ahmadinejad, who was basically talking about removing Israel from the map and firing missiles, and he got, I think, the very heavy UN sanctions on the country, where even Russia and China voted to impose sanctions on Iran. And that was, I think, somewhere between 2009 and 2013. So what changed later? And then Obama actually initially increased sanctions on Iran before making a move, offering to negotiate and offering to sign the nuclear deal, which happened in 2015, was implemented 2016. And the nuclear deal said that UN sanctions were lifted and US secondary sanctions were lifted. So what was left were US primary sanctions. Now, what that means is, so US primary sanctions basically say that Americans cannot touch Iran. They cannot invest there, they cannot do business with Iranians, and so on. Nothing. And US secondary sanctions say that everyone else should not be doing either the same thing as Americans or to a less extent. So what happened was that the secondary sanctions were lifted, UN sanctions were lifted. So suddenly all non-US persons were allowed to engage with Iran. And that was in 2016. That was why we got involved with Iran, why there was a lot of excitement in Europe, especially about business in Iran, because the legal obstacles were gone. Now this obviously changed with the change of the U.S. administration, but that was the situation then. And look, like the big opening, meaning when Americans could start to invest in the country in Iran, could happen after primary sanctions were lifted. But this will be a longer term process. I mean, this will require Congress approval. This would require, so Republicans would have to be, I think at least 10 Republicans would have to be on board. So it will not happen soon, and it would have to be combined with also, other things that Iran would commit to. So not only the nuclear, the uranium enrichment that you mentioned. So yes, okay. So going back to Obama, Obama said, you stop uranium enrichment, and we lift the secondary sanctions, and well, pretty much this is what happened. Now, what Obama wanted in the long term, and then what Trump said was that, okay, but we want you to also stop doing other things like meddling in the region. So stop sponsoring all the militias, all the groups across the region that are causing problems, and also stop working on your missiles, on your ballistic systems. So when Iran hears that, they are saying, well, first of all, missiles, I think it's a no-go. I think they will never agree to stop working on their well, defense systems or missile systems. They say it's only defense systems. Why? Well, they look, after the revolution, so 79, where the country was, still not well set up, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at that time, attacked Iran, using actually a lot of weapons that he got from Americans. And Iran didn't have any missiles at that time, and they couldn't defend against what Hussein was throwing at them. And at that time, Iran actually reached out for help, to Europe, to the US, to the neighbors, and so on, and they didn't get any help from anyone. And now they are using this argument, and I think it actually makes sense, that look, we have the right to protect ourselves. We experienced, a serious 8-year war that was devastating. No one helped us, so sorry, but we will not negotiate on that. And so this is one argument. And then when it comes to, the groups working in the region, well, it's more nuanced. I mean, obviously, the US will say, look, these are terrorists and you're just supporting terrorists. Iran will say, look, as you pointed out, these are freedom fighters, or these are Shia minorities in a Sunni region, and and they need help because they are a minority, and everyone around them is aggressive. So we are just supporting our own, and this is, or we are supporting Palestine, or the minority in Lebanon, or Yemenis, or Shia minority in Nigeria, actually. So yes, this is the philosophy. Then the US will say, which is a valid argument, look, they behave like terrorists, so their tactics are like terrorists. So that's why they are terrorists. And the argument, it's not easy to resolve. So I think it will be, for Iran, it's also part of their defense strategy, let's say, that they are getting involved in the region before anything comes to Iran. Look, Iran is the most stable country in the region. Like, really nothing happens there. Tehran, city of 10 million people, 10 p.m. at night, you see women walking by themselves, nothing is happening. And it's not because police is on every corner. No, it's just pretty safe. Okay, probably I stick to the better parts of Tehran, but still, okay, it's a 10 million people city, so everything is happening in the city, and in the center you just feel safe. And they say, okay, that's partly because we are active in the region and we don't wait for the problems to come to us. So, well, this is what they are discussing about. I don't think that the Iranians would, that it would be easy to make Iranians just stop getting involved or stop working on their missiles, unless there is like a really long-term incentive, long-term deal where they would get a lot, they would benefit a lot from. Only something like this would make them, change their strategy, change their behavior.
Yeah. Well, what's very difficult from the outside, and you are an Iranian insider now, and that's why I'm asking. And I noticed from Eastern Germany, think about it, how difficult it was to see what is with the people on the ground, the actual people who live in that country, what is their opinion. and what is an oppressive government, a tyrannic government opinion, right? So we see this in North Korea, we see this in Iran, we kind of assume this for China, maybe true or not. We assume this for Russia, maybe true or not. But we have trouble, and I think the US is always very careful to make that distinction, even though it gets lost. We know there's people on the ground who have maybe very different incentives, very different goals, very different objectives, very different opinions, but they're not allowed, or they're not able to really create a voice in that country because of suppression, or maybe because they are too stupid. You know, you can say this about Eastern Europe. Why did the revolution in '89 not happen in '96 or '49? That's a very interesting discussion to have, I think. It's so what when you said that earlier, there isn't a big political revolution that you see coming up. And I think the US was very supportive, and there's demonstrations, and then they die down after 2 days because people lose their jobs, and you know there's a lot of ramifications from this. When you get a sense of what people on the ground actually feel, even though they're not able to officially say that, and maybe they're dissidents, but what do you think are the goals of the population? Do they differ from the administration? Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, so I think it's in Iran you have it's a quite diverse society. So you have, you know, different parts of population may think in a bit different way. So the wealthy parts of Tehran are, in terms of their mindset, in terms of their aspirations, ambitions, the lifestyle that they would like to have, it's very much like Western Europe, like the Western world. The same goes in terms of how religious they are, their what they need, what they want in terms of personal, you know, freedom, political freedom, and so on. On the other hand, when you go to smaller cities, people are much more conservative. You can even see this in the way, you know, they dress, the way, you know, what lifestyle they have, which is much more religious, much more dogmatic in terms of mindset. So it's not the case that, you know, all Iranians think the same. There is no opposition in the country. For, you know, different reasons. I probably think it's similar to China, which is you know, it's a quite an efficient machine, right? That is working there, the system, and that's it, and it's just controlling everything. So I think it's just similar picture there. But people, you know, at least over the last, you know, 4 years, when it was really tough, I mean, and it was really depressing because they had a lot of hope. It was amazing. It was so much hope, like 2016, 17. And then Trump came over and this hope was crushed, right? So without getting into argument whether, you know, what was justified was what not, just what I saw when I talked to people was that their optimism, you know, and hope that I could see 2016 was gone, completely gone. And but still, you couldn't sense that people suddenly thinking about, you know, revolution, going out on the street and, I don't know, fighting with the government or whoever. People were more always focused on evolution. So they want change. They want, like everywhere, usually want the system to change in one way or another. Maybe in Iran a bit more, but more through evolution than revolution. That was always my sense. Maybe it might change, but this is what I've always experienced.
Yeah, I remember the days of '89 when you know, people were on the streets, but it was all, I mean, it was 99.99% peaceful, right? And then people were like, well, simply we want to go to Western Germany for a couple of days, and they were like, okay, you can go, but you have to like go through this process, right? And then a week later they said, oh yeah, you can still go, but you can only go to Berlin. And then a week later they were like, okay, you can go wherever you want. And then a week later, okay, now you get, Western Germany would give you money when you come over, right? Just to visit Western Germany. It was a very interesting program. And this changed so quickly. Like, it was an evolution, but the evolution was every week there was a different reaction to that pressure. So I feel like it always starts with an evolution, but the speed of the evolution looks to the outsider like a revolution. Like, nobody wants violence. So I think this is true for both sides.
So it's a different pace in Iran, because I think it's more driven by demographics than political events. You know, in Eastern Europe, things had a catalyst, and it just started happening quickly. In Iran, this is actually a similarity with other Middle Eastern countries, is that, you know, whatever philosophy was the dominant one back in 1979 and over the following, you know, 2 decades, it cannot be the same philosophy right now, because the majority of the population were born after the revolution, and they just cannot relate to these slogans, to this original philosophy. So they have different aspirations, they have different worldview and mindset, and that's why the system has to change, I think. Same thing in Saudi Arabia, right? People are just super young. They know what they want from the internet, basically, and so that's why they also need to adjust. So it's not because the system wants to adjust; it doesn't have a choice. They need to adjust. So, but that's why it's also happening much slower, I think, over there.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I was just in Egypt for a couple of weeks, and you can see it in Egypt too, right? You see this huge modern part of Egypt, which is propelled by young people, but I mean, it goes up to the 40s, I feel. And then you have this other part of Egypt, which kind of clashes with it, which is, you know, very comfortable Muslim values, traditional values, keeping you safe, keeping you in the right mind space, being close to God, which is really was, I think, the most popular philosophy to look at your own country for a long time. And now these young people are there, and they both just want, I think they just want to be left alone, right? But making a cohesive policy out of this is almost impossible, because they're kind of at current philosophy, how we look at the world, they're kind of opposite ends. We see this in Afghanistan right now, right? So we thought it's going to be modern democracy, but oh, you know what? Actually, what a good part of the country wants is the opposite, which is no democracy and being close to God, being close to Islamic values, being close to Sharia. And that's kind of a surprise, right? So the end of history didn't arrive. I mean, like Fukuyama said, wasn't the end of history. The history is still going on, right? So there's always something new. But talking about something new, I want you to give us an idea what is really hot in Iran right now. So we know there's a lot of state-owned enterprises that are basically probably not your focus, but there must be other great businesses, and we heard of Bitcoin mining, but other businesses that are worth investing into, where you think this is really going to rocket the next 10 years, with or without a big catalyst. What are you actively researching right now? What kind of businesses?
Mm-hmm. So, there's, the good thing about Iran is that it's a, proper economy, well-diversified economy. So all this oil and gas is just, maybe 5% of GDP. Used to be 15 before sanctions, and now it's somewhere, I don't know, in single digits somewhere. So the rest, you have, manufacturing, services. Most of industries, most of sectors are there because they didn't have a choice. They had to develop all the different industries to become, to as much as possible self-sufficient because of the sanctions, so that basically they could survive all the restrictions put on them, and it worked. So this was one thing, but also they had enough scale, a scale of, again, there's 84 million people, but also the export markets that are around them, where Iranians, have traditional historical connections. Many of these countries speak the same language, so it was easy for them to export. So what we are looking for is last 4 years, and I think right now it's also a similar time, that it's worth looking at companies that are basically dollar assets that just happen to be listed in Tehran. So you have exporters or companies that sell domestically, but at prices that are benchmarked against some global prices. And whenever the local currency depreciates, their revenue just jumps together with the dollar. Their earnings accelerate even more because of operational leverage. they keep their costs in depreciated real, and the revenue is in dollars. So all the additional dollar appreciation, all this additional revenue goes straight to to operating profits. So these are the companies that usually tend to benefit, show the acceleration of profits first when the currency depreciates. And so right now the currency started to depreciate again in the second half, which we expected to some extent, because there's a couple of factors. Usually after the presidential election, the currency depreciates a bit because they try to stabilize it before the election. Then you had lockdowns again, and lockdowns do have an impact because important sources of hard currency that goes into Iran is the regional trade. One source is the big trade, but this is affected by U.S. sanctions. So whatever Iran was selling to China, Japan, South Korea, European countries, and so on. So to China, they still sell, but it's not that easy to get payment. So the regional trade, which is not really affected by sanctions, so whatever goes to Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, Uzbekistan, whatever, this is an important source of hard currency. So when you have lockdowns, then for a couple of weeks, border crossings are closed, then you don't have enough dollars. And there are some imports of some essential goods that just have to happen, whatever the price of the dollar, right? So very inelastic. So it will just, the dollar could just jump when there is not enough supply. On paper, the central bank has quite big reserves, or foreign reserves, but in reality, they cannot access them. So whatever they can access is just not enough. So at the end, they have to print money more than they would like to, which again fuels inflation, which fuels the depreciation of the local currency. So you have this moment right now when again you had some lockdowns, plus Afghanistan was off for some time, but it's actually going back to normal very quickly from the Iranian point of view. So a week ago, the main border crossing for trade between Iran and Afghanistan was reopened, and now all three, I think, are open and working properly. Afghanistan reduced the custom duties on the Iranian gasoline and oil imports. So this has resumed as well. And I was reading that actually the Taliban leadership was in Tehran 6 months ago, before the takeover basically of the country. So potentially, there was a deal done at that time that Iran would be very pragmatic, basically, with the relations with Afghanistan. And I think this is what's happening. Same for Pakistan, same for Russia, China, and so on. So anyway, so what I wanted to say is that right now you have a couple of factors that affect the currency. So the dollar is moving higher, given the exchange rate of the dollar versus real and the expected future profits of the Iranian exporters. Well, the share prices are way too low. So easy money right now is to buy shares of the exporters of Iranian exporters. Now, what else is interesting? What is driven by macro, and all the last 4 years were very much driven by macro, were the domestically oriented industries. So companies that were selling domestically were benefiting a lot from sanctions and currency depreciation because their competitors were just priced out of the market. So when you had a big currency move, even exporters from China were just too expensive, and everything. And because of sanctions, everything was getting more difficult. So making the payment, arranging the logistics, and so on. So we saw local companies, even though the whole market was not growing, was stable. The local producers were gaining market share, so you could see growth there. And we were able, because there is so much data being reported by the local listed companies, that we were able to track this on a monthly basis to understand the volumes per product line and the unit prices, at which they were selling, to understand, okay, so who is doing better and versus our expectations and so on. So these are there are actually, there, as you know, there are many misconceptions about Iran in the West, right? In all areas, right? From misconceptions about the population, where, I don't know, many people or newspapers or media are just trying to portray Iran as country of terrorists who hate, Jews and Israel and so on, to misconceptions about the economy of Iran, that is just bleeding and it's just Venezuela or Zimbabwe and it just fall apart and so on, which is obviously all far from being true. And when it comes to population, it's a very tolerant and open society. When you go there and someone speaks even as a tourist, and someone speaks any English, he will approach you and just to have a chat with you. You have, Catholic or Christian churches, or Orthodox churches, Jewish synagogues, Zoroastrian, churches, temples, and everyone is doing his own thing in terms of religion. So it's absolutely not true that they're like intolerant. So it's actually a very open society, and same for the economy, where actually, because of the diversification of the economy, because of the fact that big part of the economy is focused on exports, because of the fact that they just allowed the real to depreciate and didn't fight, to just defend it, with any reserves they had. They helped it to, the local companies to improve competitiveness and actually help the economy under tough sanctions under Trump. Interesting thing is that unemployment actually went down under Trump. Unemployment in Iran, because manufacturing companies had such, great couple of years. I think there were 2 years that when they had like record profit growth, that they increased employment. They started hiring people, so it was like counterintuitive. But going back to your question, so we are looking at a couple of manufacturers that are providing specialized machinery to the domestic petrochemical and steel plants. There's a very big petrochemical and steel industry in Iran. Petrochemical industry is probably, together with the Saudi petrochemical industry, these are the most profitable industries in the world, petrochemical industries. Well, obviously, thanks to the cheap gas that they have. Also, Iran makes more than 1 million cars per year, so the steel industry is big, and all the related industries as well. And there are companies that provide some specialty, parts, machinery to these bigger plants, where those manufacturers have very strong pricing power because they are so small and specialized in the big picture for the big manufacturers, that they don't really care that much about the pricing, and it's also very difficult to import them. So they have a good pricing power. It's they don't have competition from the foreign competition. So we are looking at those. We're looking at some local brands in the cleaning products, and in the companies that make just everyday equipment, household equipment. They're also well positioned to have strong brands, well positioned to grow their businesses. There is one interesting supermarket chain that is growing online delivery, exactly the same as you could find in, I don't know, Ocado in the UK or some other companies in Western world. So this is something where we see strong growth over the next couple of years, over the next decade. I mean, my favorite company, if I could buy the whole company. We're actually working on it. So one thing is being active being an active manager on the stock market, but we're looking also at a couple of companies that we would basically like to take over, like separate from the fund, just arrange an SPV and take advantage of the fact that I think over the next couple of quarters, there may be some opportunities that will not happen again, a couple of years from now, because it will be still too early for the big players from the West to go on and get involved, because it will always takes time to get a set, to set yourself up to your presence in Iran, compliant with all the regulations, sanctions, and so on. It will take 18 months or whatever. So there will be a window where it should be possible, with some sanctions, the key sanctions lifted, it should be possible to acquire some assets from sellers that don't care. And just to give you an example, there is for example, a holding company that holds brands, consumer staples, brands like personal hygiene products. They have around 20% of the market, well-known brands, and so on. So this is the type of stuff, when you have foreign investors that go to some new frontier market, they always go for these type of investments first, right? Brewery, soap maker, whatever, right? So something
sounds like out of a Jim Rogers playbook.
Exactly.
He would buy those companies in a heartbeat.
So even in frontier markets, they often trade at 20, 25 times earnings, even if the market trades at 10 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So here we're looking at one holding company that is also trading at the below the NAV. So effectively, you can buy these assets at around, let's say 5 times earnings. And just to give you the order of magnitude, they control 20% of the local market, plus they export a bit, and it's valued at $100 million. I mean, $100 million for 20% market share in a big country like this, profitable, super profitable. You're buying this at 5 times earnings.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that Unilever will be happy to pay 10x, in a couple of years. So this is the type of stuff that I would be super excited about to just take over, in full.
It sounds really exciting. I mean, that sounds like a slam dunk, seeing it from the outside. And if there's ever a catalyst coming up there. The one thing that I hear from you is really, I find that really counterintuitive, but maybe all these sanctions actually helped Iran. And here's the argument, is most countries that export a lot of commodities, they sooner or later fall into the Dutch disease. So there isn't much you can do about it. And we see this in Africa a lot, because the economies are so small, and literally takes one oil field to destroy the value of their currencies. Currency appreciates, which you think, oh, it's a good thing. Well, it is if you are getting money from that oil field, but if you're an entrepreneur and in the services sector, not part of that commodities extraction, you're in trouble, because local labor compared to the US dollar is extremely expensive. That happened in most African countries because they found commodities to a certain extent. Angola is the best example, and Nigeria. It basically destroys your own economy. It seems like the sanctions and the inability to export has helped Iran to stay competitive, because what you're saying seems extremely competitive, well-educated labor force for $200, $500 a month is incredible, right? So this is a great deal that you will hard-pressed to find even anywhere in the world. So maybe all these sanctions, as terrible as we feel they are, and it's probably the hampered economic growth, they put the whole country on a different track than it would be if it was just oil and gas extraction.
Well, definitely, but that happened a long time ago, right? I mean, not because of Trump's sanctions. Maybe there was a risk some time ago, but I don't know. Wouldn't be able to tell that Iran would end up with an economy similar to Iraq, for example, where it's 90% or more it's just oil, right, and nothing. Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, I think of Saudi Arabia, where literally nobody has to work and nobody does work. So it seems
like they want to change it, but it's just impossible right now. It's too late.
Yeah.
They try to take away some of the social handouts, and then they got scared that people might just revolt, right, and go on the street and threaten the royalty, right? So they backed away. So look, but it's also different tradition, different culture in Iran. It's, these are Persians. I mean, they were building the first highways so that caravans could go faster, right? So it's I guess
Yeah.
it's in their blood. Plus, the location of Iran. I mean, this is another catalyst. So Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese big project
Yeah.
to connect, the Chinese cities with Western Europe. This is a real thing, and Iran is exactly, on this path, and potentially it's one of the key. Yes, I would say it's one of the key elements to it. So you already have a train, a freight train that goes from Shanghai or Xi'an, I think, in China to Tehran, and it cuts the time and cost quite significantly versus the sea route, or especially right now when you don't have all the problems with the containers and the ships that you have right now, and the inflation of the shipping costs. So Iran is important for China from that perspective. It's also important for China because it's one of the sources of energy, of long-term energy supplies for China, which they need, and they think very long-term, so they want to secure those. It's not only Iran; they're speaking about the same thing with Saudi Arabia and so on. But this is what they need. And what Iran needs money. Iran needs investment. Iran is underinvested in so many areas. So pretty much whatever money you invest in Iran, it will be a productive investment, most likely, right? Because there is stuff that is needed. If you build infrastructure, it will fuel growth for the next generation, right? So it's a very productive investment. So it's not like Japan in the 90s. They signed this long-term partnership where China said, look, we're going to invest $400 billion over the next 25 years. And big part of it will be front-loaded. So we invest more at the beginning. We will invest in your oil and gas infrastructure. So we will help you produce more oil. And we'll build highways, airports, ports, and also we will help you upgrade your petrochemical industry, if I remember correctly. So I mean, the details are quite vague. They never published it, so we will see, obviously. But and Iran will have to pay for it, but they will pay in discounts, in big discounts, on oil that they will sell to China. So when you look at it from Iran perspective, look, Iran's GDP, I mean, it's always difficult to calculate it because you don't know which exchange rate to take, I mean, from which period. But let's say it's $200 billion. So they're getting, $400 billion over 25 years. So it's like 8% GDP per year, but it's actually front-loaded, part of it. Directed into the areas where investment is really needed. So it will be very productive, helping the growth for the next 25 years. And all they have to do is they actually have to dig up more oil, with which Chinese will help them, and just sell it at a 30% discount. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that this oil would just remain underground because with sanctions, they wouldn't be able to sell it and to extract it probably. And they would be getting no money. So it actually looks, this is a bigger deal than, Eastern Europe got from the European Union cohesion funds. It's actually bigger than Marshall Plan. So it's a huge thing for Iran. And so they still haven't published the details, which is obviously an argument that maybe it will not happen. But on the other hand, it makes sense. It makes commercial sense. So it's not based on some friendship, that they want to show that Iran is close with China and against the US or whatever. Something that can easily change, right? But it's just based on common interest, and it makes commercial sense. That's why I'm quite optimistic about that. So, and this is actually a pretty good alternative for Iran. when it comes to JCPOA negotiations. So Iran can actually say, well, to some extent, that look, we don't have to do it. We could go together with China. But Iran understands that their position versus China is stronger if they also have JCPOA signed with the West, right? So they actually need both. But anyway, so this is one of the catalysts that could happen to Iran as well over the next 2 decades.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind too is a bit like Jim Rogers was so bullish on China in the 90s, right? So every book was basically put your money in China, put your money in China. And he was right, but he was also wrong in the sense of for the outside investor who expected an open equity marketplace, where equities would rise up without state intervention. It didn't happen that way. So as an outsider to start a company in China or to be active as an investor on the ground, it's still hard, was always hard since the 90s. Investing in equities was it didn't go where the GDP growth went, which clearly he was right on that, right? So there was no doubt about it. But making money off this forecast was hard. And I feel something could happen with Iran, China, and Russia. They already play these war games together, and it's always against Taiwan, or it's against something. It's against Vietnam, someone out there. I feel like there is, and obviously that's a downside. It doesn't have to materialize, but there is this axis developing against the US or against Europe. And while the investments would still grow, and Iran will undoubtedly grow, it's hard to really profit from this because the company, it's difficult to sell at equities, it's difficult to get the money out. It's maybe the shareholders are being defrauded by the government, right? So the money is going somewhere else, it's going into the actual stakeholders, so I always feel that we think of the public marketplace and equity marketplace as something that works with our rules that we have established, and that sooner or later grows the equity. But I don't think that really happened in China and also Russia. That's the problem, right? With all these big oil companies where we never know who's actually controlling them or where does the money go. Do you think that there's a huge risk in Iran? And you obviously are ready to take that risk, but how do you make sure you're losing your hair, even though the economy grows, right? But the equity investment you did will never really return any profits, the cash that you get out in your bank account.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, Iran is not Russia, meaning the structure of the economy is different. Russia, much more reliant on commodities and on this huge state-owned companies. I had a couple of wealthy Russians on an investor trip in Tehran, and well, they were super excited because we were stuck in the traffic, in this taxi in Tehran, and they were looking around. It's like, wow, it's like Moscow from 20 years ago or from 30 years ago. Also, the city is similar size, the traffic is as bad, But then I told them, we were talking about the economy, and I said that look, probably half of the economy is controlled by the state one way or another. So state-linked entities. In Iran, it's Revolutionary Guards, plus some state-owned entities, religious foundations, different entities in different countries, but it's roughly half of the economy. And these Russians just looked at me and, okay, so they screwed up. I mean, why only half? I mean, it's like, from the Russian perspective, it's only half, right? Because in Russia, it's, I don't know, 80, 90%, right? And then when you read about it, it's actually the average for the emerging economies, from India, Brazil, even to South Korea, if you look at chaebols as some sort of, I don't know, also linked entities, it's usually around 40, 50%. So this is pretty much in line. So there is much more private business that has nothing to do with commodities. So this is the big difference. And it's also visible on the stock market. The stock market has 50 different industries listed, with the biggest one being, I don't know, petrochemicals, probably with something must be like 25% of the market cap, and then lower, some mining, some banks, some telecoms. But you have everything, pretty much everything that you see in other markets. So you have different exposures, so exposures to different parts of the economy. So there's always something in the bull market, like fundamentally, right, where things are improving. So this gives you the opportunity to find businesses where the majority owners have similar, aligned interest with minority shareholders. Yes, so that's the main difference with these countries. Then you could say, okay, that if foreign investors don't go there, then there will be not enough money, and these equities will stay cheap forever. For example. Well, I'm not sure. So I don't believe.
I actually wouldn't worry about that. I mean, the GDP growth
can stay at 4 times, 5 times earnings. If they stay for a longer time at those valuations, I'm happy to wait. Okay, I'll wait. Yeah. I'll be collecting at that time, with those valuations, I'll be collecting 20% dividend yields. So I wouldn't be. And also last year, when you had a bull market in the local equities, you had 4 or 5 million, retail investors coming to the market, and obviously just driving it higher. So there's, capital in a lot of retail capital as well. But also, so think about the last 4 years. So under Trump, you had pretty tough situations. So the currency dropped by 85% under Trump. And yet the stock market, the index, returned, well, roughly doubled, so around 100% in dollar terms. So even in those, really this bad situation with super unstable economy, geopolitics, where basically people were talking about some military conflict every quarter, right? Or if not, then new sanctions were coming in. You had a very good performance of the stock market. I think it was the best equity stock market in the world in 2019. 2020 was also decent. So it's and the stock market at the end of the day, it's driven by earnings growth. So so this is the question you need to answer, right? Will earnings grow there, or will they just become stagnant there, or just go down? Look, another point that you made is that those sanctions actually helped the economy as a whole, because it had to diversify, it had to adjust to unstable conditions, which is I think it's pretty good, because local companies are like the opposite of the Western companies. Western companies are organized just in time, right? Must be super efficient, maximize your margin, and work just to deliver goods just in time. So in Iran, they are organized just in case, right? Because people understand that they don't know the future, and they expect the future to be volatile. So they really have to be built to survive, right? So this is a good thing now, but it will be also a source of additional profits, I think, in the future. Because now think about the economy that is opening up. When you have opening up of the economy, Iran starts selling more oil. They will get at least $50 billion per year from oil revenue. $50 billion solves all the problems in Iran, meaning budget deficit, the trade balance, financing of imports. With this amount, everything is pretty much solved. So what happens? Inflation stabilizes, because the inflation is around 40% right now, and mainly because of the currency depreciation. Before Trump, inflation was single digit. It actually touched 7 or 8% at some point, but it was around 10% for quite a long time. And there is no reason why it shouldn't go back there. So when you have stable prices, local companies, local consumers as well, but local companies will be able to forecast things, to maybe make long-term plans, long-term investment plans. So they will start to invest. Also, interest rates should go down. When inflation goes back to 10%, why and there is no problem with budget deficit, why interest rate, yield to maturity on the local bills should be 22%. I mean, it will be lower. So So with lower interest rates, lower financing costs, and better stability in the macro stability, companies will start to invest. Plus, they will be able to allow themselves to maybe keep, I don't know, lower inventories, not plan for war, but just plan for normal, business as usual conditions, which should help improve their margins. Exporters will actually be able to export without trying to disguise their products as non-Iranian, so just maybe smuggling them through Oman or Pakistan or whatever. This costs money, everything costs money, and offering discounts to entice the buyers. And this hurts them, their margins. So this will help with the margins. Plus volumes will go higher because many exporters are just selling below their capacity. So you have with economy that is reintegrating with the rest of the world, a lot of good things will happen, including which will affect profits, which will affect investment, which will affect GDP growth, and also with lower interest rates. This is another argument why those valuations will just not stay at where they are now, which we see. We find companies that are trading at forward 3 to 4 times earnings, right? And with those kind of valuations, investment risks are really, really manageable. I mean, you don't have to worry about this.
Yeah, it sounds really fascinating. Just so we know that as a disclaimer, anyone can invest. At what point in your fund? What's the minimum? And it excludes anyone who is a U.S. person, right? Anyone else can invest.
Yes, so everyone who is not a U.S. person and anyone who can invest at least 100,000 euros. So this is our regulatory minimum because we are classified as alternative investment fund, and we can only offer the fund to professional investors who are defined in the Netherlands. This is where we are based, as anyone who can invest 100,000 euros.
Okay. Well, that was fascinating. That was very enlightening. Maciej, thank you so much for your time. That was awesome. What a great insight into Iran.
Great. Thank you, Thorsten.
Hey, talk to you soon. Thank you, Maciej.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.